Awesome, thanks so much. It's really good to become part of the fold. I've known Rory for a little while. Many of you might know him as a past speaker in TGIF, or as Nelson Mandela's bodyguard, or the book that he wrote, or I think he's run 12, 13 Comrades marathons, or for protecting contestants at Miss World. He's given TED Talks in Auckland. He cycled around South Africa and Australia for his particular fundraising for slain officers in duty. He's run a 2013 Antarctica marathon. That's the outward face of Rory Steyn. I've known him as a youth leader in the 19s, a long time ago. And his dad was at the same church as we are, grew up with his two brothers and his wife, Gillian. And I knew him before he became an officer in the police force. He happened to marry Jill on the same day that we got married. And if Craig Linden's here, he got married on the same day, but he was in Cape Town, so I couldn't attend his wedding. But we've known each other for a long while, and it's been a wonderful time. He's married to Gillian, who's a principal of a school. They've got three sons, Carl, Ian, and Craig. And Rory, it's just great to have you. Thank you so much for agreeing to be part of our Midlands launch of TGIF.
How could I say no, John? That's crazy. Thank you for the welcome. And oh wow, look at those photos, Scotborough Beach.
Now, that was about 30 years ago. So I managed to pick up a couple of photographs. The guy in the stripes is Kirby, Rory's brother. And I think that's Jill's sister who's dropping something in Rory's bag behind there.
Yeah, Corin. Yeah, that's exactly right. Wow. Yeah. I don't know where you found those photos, but well done, John.
Yeah. Rory, when we first chatted about this, the death of George Floyd was big in the newspapers, and we were going to look at the whole issue of racial killings. But then we thought, let's broaden this out a bit. There's a whole lot of police brutality. It's rife in the media virtually every day. Maybe you just want to speak about. Let's kick off with the George Floyd incident, and we want to speak about the age of rage and just what's causing policemen to be so uptight and so tense in a situation like we're facing today.
Well, John, I could spend the entire 60 minutes of TGIF this morning talking about that, but I think that in the main there are a few things that are important to note. The first is that the job itself is a very high pressure one. It is one that can cause your nerves to become raw. It is one that often, just because of what the work that you do, leads to confrontation. It's not a phenomenon that is unique to any one particular city or country, but pardon me, policemen all over the world find themselves sucked into sometimes overplaying their hand when they are dealing with offenders. So if we look at that specific incident, the George Floyd incident, there is no justification whatsoever for the way that those police officers behaved. Many would say that there is no justification for what subsequently happened when police vehicles were torched and buildings were burned. But the reality is that none of this is going to stop, John, this side of eternity. While ever there is evil in men and women's hearts, we are going to see violence and brutality. So this is nothing new. And when cops overstep and perpetrate violence against offenders, or violence against cops is perpetrated by offenders while under arrest or in any other circumstance, we should not be surprised.
All right, but we've got that incident just on the news last night of the Metro cops in Cape Town going in and destroying shacks.
Yeah.
Their lives are not threatened, and yet they still seem to have this hunger for power, and they almost feel that their authority is threatened when people stand up against them. But when somebody's in their home, in their little shack, and they're dragged out during a bath, I mean, why so much anger and rage?
I think that what we need to do in that instance is we need to go back to whoever it was that issued those instructions. Just remember that cops, like soldiers, are creatures of a force or a service, and that is subjected to commanding officers above them that issue instructions. That's the first thing. The second thing is they are also guided and led by the law. Police, by the very nature of their office, are law enforcement officers. So somebody gave those instructions. I can't, and I don't know the background to it, so I won't comment beyond what I'm going to say now, other than to say that I cannot understand why any police commander would give instructions to have those structures removed and people taken out of their homes in the middle of winter. It's July in the Southern Hemisphere, and I don't see why it has to happen now. There may be very good reasons why, and I don't know what those are. But to come back to something that you said earlier, it struck me, even now that I'm no longer a police officer, what strikes me in this conversation about police brutality and violence against police is that one of the things that will always get the back of a cop up is when their authority is challenged. So sometimes it's not even about the merits of the case. It's not about whether or not I actually did throw that piece of paper or my Kentucky wrapper out of my car window into the middle of the street. It's not about that. It's about the fact that you, as a civilian, are challenging me as a police officer, and that mere act is enough to get my back up and possibly lead to me overstepping my bounds as a cop. So that's just something that struck me. I don't know necessarily where to go with it. It's a comment, though, that I wanted to make because it's a fact.
So it's not just a South African thing. It's not just an American thing. It's universal. It's worldwide.
Absolutely.
We were chatting about India yesterday, and you used words. You didn't say crowd control. You said crowd management.
Yeah.
Just a nice way of saying we will control you no matter what.
That's right. And it's also like, sorry to interrupt you, John. It's also like, because it came up just now in one of your comments, that when I joined the police force in 1982, it was just that it was actually called the South African Police Force. So it was the SAPF. And then with the advent of democracy, it became the SA Police Service, because service sounds a whole lot better than force. Force indicates the iron-fisted approach. And unfortunately, that was rolled back. I'm not sure when. I think possibly in the early 2010s, we went back what happened was when we went from a force to a service, we also demilitarized the police ranks. So I, at the time, was a lieutenant colonel in the police force. And when it became the SA Police Service, my rank changed to superintendent. And I wasn't all that happy, to be very honest with you, because superintendent sounds like a janitor of a block of flats or something like that. But it's a very British police rank, superintendent. And the whole idea behind that was part of the demilitarization of the police, and part of the changing from a force to a service was to take those military ranks out of the vocabulary. But then our current minister, when he was commissioner, General Cele, he went back to those military ranks, and that's why he's now a general and not a commissioner. Well, actually, he's a minister now. So I don't know whether that was a good or a bad move. But the point is this, that when you say a police force, or when you say crowd control, it immediately, just in the wordage, indicates that iron-fisted approach. It's, we are going to control you.
While you're saying that it's this, we don't have this iron-fisted approach. You can change the names, but it's still there.
Yes.
You're still getting. Well, it's easy to point at the police force, and it's easy to look out there and say it's all their problem. But this rage is throughout our country at the moment. It's throughout the world. There's domestic violence, there's road rage, there's racism, there's violent protests, there's xenophobia. Everybody's just so hyped up. It's even within us, because for those who are going out and protesting and disrupting the lives of other people, they're upset because there are people sitting at home not joining them. And for the people sitting at home and not joining them, they're pointing fingers at the people who are rioting and saying, why can't we get our economy right? Well, it's because of these guys. So there's still rage within each one of us. What is the problem?
Change.
What's wrong with the world?
Yes, it's a little three-letter word called sin. And that sin manifests itself in very different ways in different people, but it's still sin. Sin is sin in sin, whether it's a cop beating up somebody he's trying to arrest, whether it's a cop who puts his knee on someone's neck and that person dies, whether it is violence in the home, whether it is illegal cigarette trade. Sin is sin, and nothing is going to change in that regard until Jesus comes again. So he came once to deal with our sin by dying on the cross for those that put their faith in him, and yet we still continue to sin. All of us, we are redeemed by what Jesus did over 2,000 years ago on a hillside somewhere outside Jerusalem. But that doesn't mean that sin is dealt with, because we have not yet gone through death and arrived in eternity where we will be perfect one day. And that's just the reality of the fallen world that we live in. We are all fallen creatures.
So we can look at that theologically and say it's all as a result of sin, but that doesn't heal the past hurts that I have. It doesn't set right the personal injustices or the broken promises. I've been told that I'm going to have a better life, and I'm not getting that better life. I'm not seeing anything. So although we can just put it under the guise of sin and say, well, it's sin, we're just going to have to live with that. Isn't there something that we can do?
Well, yeah, I would hesitate to say that we're just going to have to live with it. But I understand where you're coming from. Yes, there is a lot that we can do, John. And now I think that even during this period of COVID-19 lockdown in South Africa, we have and we continue to see South Africans doing extraordinary things to help their fellow man. We have seen amazing initiatives. We have seen people, kind of get up off their couches and ask themselves, well, what can I do? What can I as one person do? And I was just reading a tweet from the Nelson Mandela Foundation on Twitter this morning, actually, while I was making tea, where they have launched a scheme. I think it's called Each One Feed One. I'm not entirely sure how it works, because it was a tweet, so there's only 144 characters in there that I was reading. But I understand the notion behind that, and that is that we don't have to do nothing. And I know that there's a lot of clergy on here who are doing something every day. I know that there are a lot of Christians listening to this Zoom call this morning who have very generous and very warm hearts. And remember that those warm and generous hearts and the generosity of spirit that we see amongst the church is precisely engendered by the Holy Spirit, who indwells in our hearts once we come to know Jesus as our Savior. He is the one that prompts those thoughts in our minds that lead to actions such as, well, let me get up off my couch and let me go to Pick n Pay and either buy some stuff and put it in a bag and take it to a food distribution center, or go online and buy a voucher from Checkers or ShopRite and send that out to those organizations who then distribute that food to those that need it, because they are the ones that know. There is even a policing dimension to that, because many people who were prompted to do something for the poor started their own thing, and they would buy a bunch of food parcels and drive into perhaps an informal settlement and start to distribute the food. And then when that food ran out, the community started asking, well, where's our food? And there was a call from the police to say, guys, please don't do that. Rather get in touch with one of the community organizations that feed poor people and those that are in need or destitute on a daily and a regular basis, and give them your donation and let them distribute it, because they have the channels and they know who needs it most. And that to me makes sense. As a cop, that to me makes sense, because there's an order and a process, to that. But I think I'm digressing, John, because your question was, what can we do? And I'm saying that what we must not do is do nothing. We must ask ourselves what Jesus did in those circumstances. He went and fed the poor. He went and healed the sick. And we can't all be an individual disciple, but we can all be a part of a collective church or community or organization that does that work.
So let's get back onto a theological note and say, if God is all powerful, why doesn't he do something? Why doesn't he wipe out the wickedness in the world? Why doesn't he just get rid of brutality? And wouldn't it be nice if he just, every time somebody murdered somebody else, they were wiped out? Why doesn't God do something?
Well, I'm not a theologian, but I have a few thoughts on that. And one of them that is, he is doing a lot. Even now, God is at work. I remember after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, where nearly 3,000 New Yorkers were killed, and those in the aircraft, of course, people were asking, well, where was God on 9/11? And I think it was Tim Keller. Was it Tim Keller? One of those pastors in New York City wrote an article, Where Was God on 9/11? And the article looked at all of the, how many lives had been saved and how much property had been protected. Even though there was that massive loss of life and huge destruction of property, God was there and God was working. And I believe he's doing that now. He's working through us as his church and as his people, as I was briefly describing earlier. But I don't think that we can truly say that all poverty is going to come to an end in our lifetime unless Jesus comes again. And that's the point. So God is at work. There is no question. God is in control. There is no question. Even when it looks like he isn't, God is there. He is in control. He sits on the throne of the universe, to quote the cliche, because he is God. He is still God, and he sees all that sin. If he came and stopped all of this stuff now, John, the question that I would ask is, well, how many people were not given the opportunity to repent and to come to Jesus and to gain that salvation that he freely offers? If he just stopped everything and he stopped it all and made it too easy, that is what I would ask. So God will stop all of the violence. He will stop all of the gender-based violence. He will stop all of the police brutality when the time is right, and he knows the time, what that time is, because he's God. Once he has brought everybody who turns to Jesus into the fold and ensured that they get to spend heaven with him and the saints and the Lord Jesus, that's when the time will be right. So you and I don't know that. Our job is to keep working and to keep serving and to keep pointing people to Jesus until that happens.
I suppose the flip side to that would be, what about those who didn't intentionally murder somebody? Should they be killed? Or the people who, Matthew 6, commit murder in their hearts? In which case there'd be very few people left here on earth, because essentially there's nobody who's good enough.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, John, because all of us, and definitely me included, I'm probably, as Paul says, the chief here, is that it's very easy to sit back and point fingers. It's very easy to look at a 2-minute video clip of that incident with George Floyd in Minneapolis and then point fingers and jump to conclusions. And we see it on movies and in TV shows. You cannot judge what a cop did in a split second, by sitting back in your chair or sitting back in the courtroom and having all the time in the world, to pick it apart. It's easy for us to point fingers, but we need to look at ourselves. We might not beat up innocent civilians. We might not destroy shacks. We might not torch police cars. But all of us have got those evil inclinations in our hearts because we are sinful beings. Yes, we may have come to Jesus. Yes, he may have cleansed us, but I can speak for myself. I came to know Jesus Christ as my Savior in 1982 while undergoing my police training in the police college in Pretoria. But I can tell you, it wasn't until my brother, who was studying to be a pastor at the time, brought a black Christian to me and we prayed together, that I started to deal with some of the prejudice that was in my heart. And it wasn't actually, to be honest with you, until 13 years later, in 1994, when I met President Mandela, that I was finally able to rid myself in my heart of that prejudice. And I remember that the question that I asked myself is, how dare you, Rory, reject somebody on whatever basis? In my case, it was the basis of the color of their skin. How dare I reject somebody for whom Jesus Christ died? If that person is acceptable to my Lord and Savior, who am I to reject that person on the basis of some man-made construct, whether it's racism or sexism or whatever ism, or just because I don't like the person or I am incensed or offended by their behavior. So it comes back to what you and I discussed, John, as we were preparing for this. It really does come back to the parable that the Lord told about the speck and the plank in your eye. And I can tell you that I've got many planks in my eye, and I've hopefully, removed a few of them, but I will continue to be taking planks out of my eye and testing the way that I see things, or the lens through which I view things on this earth, until Jesus comes. And that's just the reality.
But doesn't that just make us sit back and do nothing, almost doormats, where people think, okay, here's a Christian, he's not going to respond, so we'll do whatever we want and we'll face God's judgment later? How do we prevent that attitude of just sort of sitting back and not doing anything about it? Surely as Christians, we need to be involved. You've mentioned buying things for poorer folk. How do we get involved in stopping police brutality, stopping xenophobia, stopping this rage against women and children, whether in the home or whether publicly?
I think, John, it starts with the first thing you need to do is get down on your knees and ask the Lord to show you how you can be a force for change. And I apologize again for that cliche. It starts with every one of us coming before God and saying, how can I be an agent for change and an agent for better? And I know that I fail in that every single day. My wife tells me constantly that it's better to be kind than to be right, because I like being right. So what does that mean? That I have a self-righteous spirit still in my heart that tells me I've got to show somebody that what you're doing is wrong because I think it's wrong. And it's that kind of selfishness and that kind of attitude that we are seeing throughout society and will continue to see until Jesus comes again. So the way to change it is to ask ourselves, what can I do to show people that there is a better way? And once you show people that there is a better way and they ask, why are you different? Then you have, of course, the great opportunity that we all seek every day to tell them about a Savior who died for the sins of the world over 2,000 years ago. So it's a matter of everybody taking their own personal responsibility and asking God in humility how we can help. He will show you. If you have a heart to serve, whether it's a desire to assist in an orphanage or in a feeding scheme or minister to people in prison or whatever it is. I've got a friend. He's a very interesting character. We played rugby together for Joburg Police in the 80s. He was now he's enormous. Then he was just big. He was a tight head prop who as a youngster came straight out of under 20 into the first team, and he was as strong as an ox, the typical South African front ranker. And today, that big guy who used to drink beer and beat people up is now a minister in our prison service. And he's got a few helpers, and he gets into this prison today and that one tomorrow and tells people about Jesus. So whether it's that or, as I said, a feeding scheme or an orphanage or whatever it is, God will show you where you can be useful. If your heart is inclined, because of his spirit that lives in your heart, if your heart is inclined to do something to make the world a better place or a more just place or a less violent place, he will show you.
Rory, I just want you to think, you served with President Mandela for a number of years. Although he had the influence and the authority to influence a whole lot of people, I know you've got specific incidences where he made a difference to individual people's lives on a one-to-one basis, not as a president, but as a person. I want you just to relate maybe one or two stories like that.
Yes. So there's one that always comes to mind, John. So just a bit of background. I was the team leader of one of the two Gauteng-based teams, and there were another 2 teams down in Cape Town. These are teams in the Presidential Protection Unit, because when Parliament is in session, which is typically the first half of the year, then the President is in Cape Town a whole lot of the time. What was different about Madiba was that he did not necessarily live in the official residence, although he did in Cape Town because he didn't have a home there. But in Joburg, he had a home, and that's where he lived with his 4 grandchildren, who we watched grow up, by the way, and not in Mahlamba-Ndlovu, which is the official residence in Pretoria that sits on that beautiful ridge overlooking Soutpansberg Street and Pretoria going north. That's where Mahlamba-Ndlovu sits. It's a beautiful residence. He didn't live there. He lived in Houghton, and we had to take him through up the M1 every day. We would start early in the morning, book the weapons out, get the cars clean, line it all up, and wait for him to walk out of the door, assist him into the car, and drive those 60 k's north to Pretoria. And and I say this with every ounce of respect that I can muster. It was interesting, because one of the great privileges of my 5 years that I served the President was that every afternoon when we got back to Houghton, no matter what time it was, it could even have been late in the evening after a dinner that he was attending or whatever, I got to stand in the President's entrance foyer, put my hand in my pocket, took from my pocket the official schedule, and I got the opportunity one-on-one for a minute or 2, just me and Nelson Mandela, and I briefed him on what tomorrow's program looked like. So I would say, Tata, we are not going to the office. We are going to a breakfast over there. This is the time that you need to arrive, and this is the time that we need to leave. And that's the point. Getting Madiba to agree to a time to depart his home to go to wherever we were going was a bit like bargaining with a Pakistani shopkeeper, because he was so punctual that he never wanted to be late. But I had already factored things like traffic conditions into the departure time. So the one morning, and this is what I want to tell you, answer to your question. I'd said to him the previous evening, we need to, you have your first appointment at 7:30 at the Union Buildings in his office, and we always would want to get to the Union Buildings at 7:15. That's just a police thing. In the police, whatever time you report for duty, you are always there 15 minutes earlier. And as I said, I loved that about Madiba because he was never late. So I knew we had to be there at 7:15, and I think I said to him we should leave at 6:30, because it's about a 45-minute drive in heavy traffic up the M1 at that time of the morning. And he said, no, I think we should leave at 6:15. Meantime, I've already factored that in. So anyway, for whatever reason, that particular day, there was no traffic on the M1, so it must have been school holidays. We caught every light green on the way to the highway, so we were on the highway in a flash, and we were flying up the M1, and we arrived at the Union Buildings in Pretoria at like 10 to 7 in the morning, and the place was an absolute ghost town. There was nobody at work. So the President is the first one to arrive for work in this instance, and we had a private entrance. We drove around the back through a police boom where there was a uniformed officer who opened up for us, and we dropped the President off, and he walked through this archway into the courtyard of the Union Buildings, where to the left was a staircase and a lift that went up to the first floor where his office was, and on the right were Foreign Affairs officers. And as we walked through that archway that particular morning, there was a cleaning lady employed by the civil service to clean the floors, and she was polishing the stoop of the Union Buildings with that red cobra wax. Well, I don't know whether the cobra wax was red, but the stoop was red. And she's down on her hands and knees, and she's cleaning the floor like this as we walk through this archway. And the old man literally almost bumps into the back of her as she's on her hands and knees, and he stops and he looks down. And he says, yes, Mama. And she hears that particular voice. She gets a fright. She tries to stand up to greet him and clean her hand of the dirty polished rag all at the same time. And he puts down his hand and he says, no, Mama, it's okay. Stay there. What's your name? Where do you come from? Where do your parents come from? How long have you worked here? And thank you for keeping our offices so beautifully clean every day. And then he walked around her. This lady was now kneeling at attention because he told her not to stand. And she, this was the last thing that she expected. And John, today, I still work with important people, no longer the most important. And I see important business people and sports people in the work that we do in the private security industry. And I see people that are so full of their own importance that maybe it's a CEO or a managing director or a whatever. When the tea lady says, "Good morning, sir," in the morning, and he just walks right past her, I have got absolutely no respect for someone like that. Because if Nelson Mandela can stop and greet the cleaning lady on her all fours, then who are you, sir, not to return the greeting of the lowliest of your employees? So that's the kind of thing I saw him do over and over again. We would go to those black tie affairs where he is the guest of honor and everybody's there in their finery, and the guys have got their penguin suits on and the ladies are wearing their finery. And we always had a holding room where we would take him before the event started. And also that was the room if he needed a one-on-one with somebody, then they could come in there and he could have that one-on-one. And when the event was ready to start, we would take him in and everybody would line up to shake the president's hand. And he would not leave that room until he had walked over there to the back where the bar counter was. And there were some waiters that were serving everybody cocktails or whatever. And he would go and greet them. That was just the way he was. Everybody was treated the same. And that's the greatest compliment that I can actually pay to Madiba, having now left his service, is that he truly was able to treat everybody the same. The way he spoke to another head of state on a state visit is the same way that he spoke to his family, to the gardener, and to us, who served him in a particular capacity. So, and I was privileged, and I do get how privileged I was. I was privileged to watch that stuff over and over again. And it made a real impact on me. And Jill and I have endeavored to teach our three boys those kind of manners. So you don't just take your food from a waiter in a restaurant without saying thank you. That person is running backwards and forwards between the kitchen and your table for not very much, in many instances only for tips. So you better say thank you.
If there is rage within us, surely we're not going to take time to speak to other people. Yeah. We're angry with everybody. We're angry with the world. We're not going to do anything about it. So that might be a barometer for us to say how much anger is really deep down inside of us. And are we even thinking of anybody else, or are we've got the sense of entitlement? I want to jump to a couple of questions, one from Pierre. In South Africa, police brutality seems to be directed overwhelmingly and disproportionately at the working class black men. If you agree, why do you think this is so?
I would hesitate to say that it's overwhelmingly directed at black men. I think that it's overwhelmingly directed at whoever that particular cop at that particular time seems to perceive as having broken the law. Now, there is also, and I'm unsure how to put this delicately, there is also, when we think of police brutality, very often we also think in this, almost in the same light of police corruption. And I think that people think that it's easier for a cop to bribe somebody from his or her own community or people group than it is to bribe somebody who obviously is wealthier and therefore has more ability to deal with the problem. So that might have something to do with it, Pierre. I don't know. What I think John said earlier is germane to this debate, though, and that is this: that when we look at whatever circumstance we're dealing with through the lenses of our own self-interest, then we are always going to be on dangerous ground. And advice that I often give to people is try, as difficult as it may be, try and put yourself into the shoes of that police officer, male or female, and ask yourself the question how you would react or act in these circumstances. Maybe you can't do that because you were never a cop, It's easy for me to do that because I was for nearly 18 years. And very often you see a different perspective as soon as you try and put yourself into a police officer's shoes, because motorists or civilians, pardon me, can become confrontational literally almost at the drop of a hat. Some of them will even bring the hat. And that is the worst thing that you can ever do when you are in a conversation with a police officer. If you become confrontational, their back goes up and they're not going to give you any leeway or leniency. So it's really a road to nowhere. But I would hesitate, Pierre, to tag on one population group or another as having been singled out.
Okay, thanks, Rory.
Yeah.
Well, Khadi, thanks, Rory and John, for an informative conversation. Rory, you mentioned the change in the police force to service and the demilitarization of it. My question is, the conversation on race not perhaps a distraction from the real issue, which is an abuse of power by the police? I think that's a good question.
It's a very good question. And just like we saw with our previous president, where we coined the phrase that, you know, a fish rots from the head, police officers will often take their lead from the commanders at the top of the pile. And if there is this iron-fisted approach and the arrogance that we sometimes see from certain of our leaders at the top there, then that's how cops are going to behave, because they think that they have an imperative, almost a tacit instruction to behave like that. So we saw those awful incidents in Natal of that, in KZN, I think it was in Durban or Mhlanga. We saw that kid walking with his little boy. I think they'd just been on the beach, and now the cops wanted to take the child away from the father. And somebody, of course, filmed it. And I don't understand why cops do stupid things in public, because obviously someone somewhere is going to have a phone and they're going to film it, and it's going to be all over the media. So I don't know why they do that. We have seen some absolutely ridiculous behavior from our police, sadly. And I say that with a heavy heart as a former cop, because I have the greatest respect for police officers. They have an unbelievably difficult task to do, and we should all be praying for them. But they do such stupid things at times. And this drunkenness on power is, as I was trying to say at the beginning, I don't think I said it very well, is part of their makeup. It's part of the job. It's part of everything that influences a cop. And it's very difficult. I can tell you this. It's very, very difficult when you're a police officer to kind of go against the flow and almost stop and ask yourself the question, is this the best course of action? Because many times you act in an impetuous manner. You call it as you see it. And sometimes you have to do that, else you die as a police officer. That's the reality. But at other times, there is perhaps occasion to take a figurative step back and ask yourself, is there a better way of dealing with this? Not a lot of cops that I know, and certainly when I was one, I didn't do that too often. We didn't do that too often. It's not how we're wired. It's not how we think, but it's probably something that we should be doing. I've said this on many occasions. I often get asked to comment, on news media, on the actions and behavior of the police. And I can honestly tell you that this is where I was going with a fish rots from the head. That a big problem with our police service as it is at the moment is the lack of effective leadership, and more importantly, the lack of effective training. Everything in policing starts with training. And if you have untrained police led by untrained commanders who are a little bit unsure of the correct course of action to take, you are asking for trouble.
Yeah. Karen suggests that the police force in the UK is different. There have been issues, but if you watch videos online and compare them, for instance, to videos of the US police, you see how polite and diplomatic and respectful they are. They get suspects to respect and obey them. What makes them this way? Also, if you watch videos of Anton Modi's team here, they can use loud noise or fright effect when chasing suspects, but once caught, they're very gentle and respectful and kind. Maybe you've touched on this in terms of training, but would you like to comment further on this?
It's absolutely a function of training. I can tell you that in my time of the nearly 18 years that I served, the last 12 of those 18 years were all in VIP protection. And the last 5 were as a member of the Presidential Protection Unit. So what that meant was that over 12 years of being a cop in South Africa, I got to work with some of the finest police officers and police units and outfits from around the world who either came here with their principals, or when I went there with Madiba, I got to work with these guys. And the comparison that the lady made, Karen made, was between the British cops and the American cops. And it is as stark as night and day. And the Secret Service, which is the federal agency that protects the president and vice president in the US, their philosophy is we throw numbers at the problem. They have got thousands of men and women and boots on the ground, and they try and turn every environment where the president is into a mini Washington, D.C., even when they come here. When they came here one time, and it actually was for the inauguration of Madiba, there were 3 of their top 4 were here. The only one who didn't come to Madiba's inauguration was Bill Clinton, but Hillary Clinton came as First Lady, and Al and Tipper Gore came as the vice presidential couple. And I remember us going to a performance at the Market Theatre in Joburg, and we were staying at the Carlton Hotel. And the motorcade to get down Commissioner Street from the Carlton to the Market Theatre was 42 vehicles long. So it took 3 street blocks where the JMPD, as they are now, then it was Joburg Traffic Department, had to close all of those intersections. And when we arrived at the Market Theatre, the metal detectors that we walked through, we as South Africans, we as South African protection officers had to walk through metal detectors. Those were all manned by Secret Service in our country. So that's how they operate. Whereas the British model is the complete opposite. The British model is very understated. It focuses a lot on proper planning and having the I won't say the minimum of resources, but far fewer resources, but efficiently and effectively deployed resources. And by the way, when I now watch images on my TV screen of the Queen in public, I don't watch the Queen and I don't worry about what hat she's wearing and what color outfit she's in. I watched what's going on around her. I'm looking for the protection officers and seeing what they're doing. And I've watched them work. I personally took President Mandela to Buckingham Palace on a state visit, and we worked with those guys for the 4 days of that state visit, and I see how they do things. Now, what I will say is this: there's a very different philosophy as to how you go about it or how they go about it. But I can tell you that they have got 100 times the budget that our cops have in South Africa. That's the first thing. And by and large, especially the British, but also the Yanks actually, their levels of academic qualifications are much higher than ours. So you're dealing with graduates when you come to the London Metropolitan Police Service, by and large. And I don't understand why we don't do that in South Africa. We've got this massive youth unemployment problem. Why aren't we using the finest and brightest of our people to come into the police service and basically to begin to chart a new way? We see what millennials do and how disruptive they have become in tech companies. Why can't we do that in policing? There are better ways of doing it, and we've got bright minds, properly educated, that we should be calling upon to find a better way. So that's a very long-winded way of saying that I think that the educational qualifications of police has a large role to play.
Yeah, and it's sad. Sam writes, as a black woman, I'm borderline petrified of SAPS.
Mm-hmm.
And
that is so sad.
We can use the word disgraceful even.
Yeah.
Rory, thanks so much. I really have appreciated it. And I think our time's almost up. I don't know if there are any other questions that folk want to ask.
Sorry, I'd like to ask a question if possible.
Go ahead.
I don't know if you heard recently there was an incident with the Joburg Metro Police, or Tshwane Metro Police, I think it might have actually been, and Dr. Emmanuel Taban, where they'd used words to the effect of, I'm going to
put my knee on your neck.
Yeah, the same way as that you did to George Floyd. And I'm like just mind blown how people are treating each other like this. And maybe there was a xenophobia built in there because he wasn't a native-born South African. But what causes people to hate like that?
Thanks for your question. So you are correct. It was very clear from that news reporting on that Tshwane incident that it was definitely a xenophobic agenda, because the doctor was, I think, from the DRC, and he had come to South Africa, but years ago. He'd come to South Africa possibly as long ago as 20 years. Yeah. And he had married a South African lady, and he had been doing great work in the community. But because he was not a South African, he was treated in that way. And the point we made earlier is the point I'll briefly make again, and that is this, that whether it's xenophobic or whether it's pure racism, as in the George Floyd incident, or whether it's just evil in the heart of a police officer bent on breaking the law himself, that he or she should be upholding, all of us have those propensities in our hearts, because we are fallen creatures. And unless we have come to a point where we accept that what Jesus did on the cross to deal with sin was for us, we will continue to do that. And we are going to have to continue to be taking those planks out of our own eyes, because all of us, sadly, have that propensity towards sin. I always liken it to the game of bowls. If you've ever held a bowling wood and rolled it down a bowling green, it's always going to veer off to one side, because there's a weight inside one side of that bowling wood that'll make it go either left or right. And all of us have got a weight inside our hearts that bends our actions and our wills and our thoughts and our deeds towards sin. And until Jesus comes again, or until we die and pass through death into eternity, it's going to be like that. But that doesn't make it right. And that doesn't mean that we don't every single day get on our knees and ask God to help us to do better today.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much, Rory. And thanks to Torsten for welcoming us into the TGIF fold.